There is a precise point at which effort stops helping you and starts actively working against you. Every elite performer has bumped into this point, usually the hard way. Most of them can describe the exact feeling of crossing it. The moment trying harder made the outcome measurably worse rather than better. The psychology behind this is one of the more counterintuitive and consistently replicated findings in performance research. And outside of sports psychology, almost nobody has actually applied it to the rest of their life. The shape of the relationship between pressure and performance. Start with the foundational finding. It's over a century old at this point, and it's still holding up. Psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson, in research originally conducted in 1908, found that the relationship between arousal, meaning physiological and psychological activation, stress, stakes, effort, and performance, isn't linear. It doesn't simply improve the harder you push. It follows an inverted U. Performance improves as arousal increases up to a specific point, and then past that point, further increases in arousal cause performance to decline, sometimes sharply. This single finding quietly demolishes an assumption baked into an enormous amount of popular advice about effort. The assumption that more caring, more intensity, more focused determination is reliably good without limit for any task. The Yerkes-Dodson relationship says this is only true up to a threshold, and that threshold varies depending on the complexity of the task. For simple, well-rehearsed tasks, the threshold sits fairly high, meaning quite a lot of pressure can still help. For complex tasks, and especially for tasks that depend on skills that have become automatic through extensive practice, the threshold sits considerably lower, meaning pressure starts hurting performance far sooner than most people expect. Often, at exactly the moment the stakes feel highest and pushing harder feels most instinctively correct. The mechanism. Why expertise makes you vulnerable, not immune. Understanding that an inverted U exists doesn't yet explain why crossing the threshold actually degrades performance. That mechanism, and it's a specific, well-studied one, comes from psychologist Sian Beilock research on what's known as explicit monitoring theory, developed largely through a series of experiments with expert and novice golfers. Beilock's research, conducted with Thomas Carr, found that highly practiced skills become proceduralized, meaning they get encoded in a form that runs largely without step-by-step conscious oversight, closer to what's colloquially called muscle memory. Their studies found that expert golfers, when asked to recall the specific details of a putt they just executed, showed notably poor episodic recollection of the exact movements involved, evidence that the skill was being executed automatically, below the level of the kind of detailed conscious tracking a novice would still require. Here's the finding that makes this directly relevant to the hook of this video. Beilock and Carr's research found that under pressure, performers frequently shift into what they term explicit monitoring, consciously attending to and attempting to control the mechanics of a skill that had, through practice, already become automatic. And this shift, their research found, actively degrades performance in exactly the skills that had become the most proceduralized, the most practiced, the most reliably automatic under normal conditions. Their experiments found that self-consciousness training, deliberately practicing under conditions that increased self-focused attention, could produce choking effects, even without any external pressure at all, while dual task training, adding a secondary cognitive load that prevented the performer from consciously monitoring their own mechanics, actually protected performance under pressure rather than degrading it. This is the mechanism, stated plainly. Trying harder under pressure for a task you've already practiced extensively frequently means redirecting conscious attention onto a process that was functioning better, precisely because it wasn't receiving conscious attention. You don't fail because you stopped caring enough to focus. You fail because you started focusing on the wrong layer of a system that had already automated that layer for good reason. And forcing conscious control back into an automated process is closer to manually overriding a well-tuned autopilot mid-flight than it is to simply working harder. Learning mode versus performance mode. This produces a critical distinction that most effort-based advice collapses into a single, undifferentiated category. There are two genuinely different modes a skill can be operated in, and according to this research, they require close to opposite approaches. Learning mode, acquiring a new skill that hasn't yet been proceduralized, genuinely benefits from conscious, effortful, deliberate attention. This is where trying harder, paying closer attention, consciously breaking down each component of the task actually help because the pathway hasn't yet been automated, and conscious oversight is the mechanism by which it gets built in the first place. Performance mode, executing a skill that has already been extensively practiced and proceduralized, requires close to the opposite approach. Here, conscious, effortful attention doesn't refine the execution. It disrupts an already functioning automatic process by forcing it back into the more limited, more error-prone, explicit system. Beilock's research identifies as the actual mechanism of choking. The failure most people make in athletics, and well beyond it, is applying learning mode effort to a performance mode situation, bearing down harder, monitoring more closely, at exactly the moment the big presentation conversation, the important conversation, the high-stakes interview, when the skill involved has already been practiced enough that it should be allowed to run on its own. And the added scrutiny is the thing actively breaking it. Flow as the experiential signature of getting the calibration right. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's extensive research on optimal experience, summarized under the concept of flow, describes the subjective state people report when performance and challenge are well matched, characterized by deep absorption, a loss of self-conscious awareness, and a felt sense of the activity unfolding smoothly, almost automatically, without effortful, deliberate control. Csikszentmihalyi's research found flow states reliably occurring at a specific intersection, where the challenge of a task closely matches a person's skill level, not too far below it, which produces boredom, and not too far above it, which produces anxiety. This maps directly onto the inverted U relationship and the explicit monitoring mechanism already described. Flow, in this framework, is essentially the subjective experience of operating in genuine performance mode, with the automated system running unimpeded by excess conscious oversight at a level of arousal that sits within the productive portion of the Yerkes-Dodson curve, rather than past the point where added pressure starts pushing performance back down. Psychological detachment as a performance tool, not a luxury. Related research on what occupational psychologists term psychological detachment, the capacity to mentally disengage from work-related stressors during non-work time, has found this detachment associated with better subsequent performance and lower burnout, rather than functioning as an indulgence that competes with performance. This finding fits the same underlying pattern. A performer in any domain who cannot mentally step back from constant, vigilant monitoring of their own performance is, in effect, staying trapped in a state that resembles the explicit monitoring condition. Beilock's research shows degrades already proceduralized skill, the capacity to genuinely ease off, to trust an already practiced process rather than continuously auditing it, isn't a sign of insufficient commitment. Across this body of research, it functions as a specific, identifiable performance skill in its own right, one that untrained, effort-maximizing intuition consistently gets backward when maximum effort actually helps. None of this is an argument that effort is generally counterproductive, and it would misrepresent the research to claim it. The Yerkes-Dodson curve still rises before it falls, and for genuinely unpracticed, unfamiliar, or highly complex novel tasks, closer, more effortful, more conscious attention remains exactly the right response, per the learning mode distinction above. The practical skill this research actually points toward isn't abandoning effort. It's correctly diagnosing in a given moment whether you're operating in learning mode, where conscious effort is still doing real, necessary work, or in performance mode, where a skill has already been practiced enough that the same conscious effort redirected onto an already automated process is now the primary mechanism of failure, rather than the guarantor of success. Closing. So the next time you notice yourself pushing harder at exactly the moment things start slipping, on a skill you've genuinely practiced, in a conversation you know how to have, in work you've done 100 times before, it's worth asking a more precise question than, am I trying hard enough? The research suggests the more accurate question is, have I drifted back into consciously monitoring something that had already, through all that practice, earned the right to run on its own? The things you've practiced the most were never going to need you watching quite that closely. That was always going to be true. It just took the wrong moment under enough pressure to make you forget it.